Yesterday, the Biden administration announced that another $5.5 billion in aid will be sent to Ukraine, with payments set to begin with a $3 billion installment this month. Total U.S. fiscal aid pledged to Ukraine now tops over $50 billion since Russia's February invasion.
In a new opinion piece, Dr. Trita Parsi contends that the U.S. is on the precipice of a three-front foreign crisis in the form of, one, a drawn-out war in Ukraine that risks escalating into a direct U.S.-Russia confrontation, two, the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal that may lead to war with the Persian Gulf power, and three, an unnecessary crisis with Beijing over Taiwan triggered by Nancy Pelosi's ill-advised trip to Taipei. Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Parsi, joins us now to expand on the Biden administration's juggling act and what the president can do to de-escalate. Welcome back, Dr. Trita Parsi.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah, so elaborate on what you discussed in this piece. First, it's Ukraine, Iran always going on in the background. Now we've added escalation over Taiwan to the mix. I guess on that last front, do you have any sense of why now, why this was chosen, seemingly by Nancy Pelosi against the administration's wishes, but they did let her do it? You know, what is your read of that situation?
Well, look, tensions with Beijing over Taiwan has been brewing and will continue to brew. But what Speaker Pelosi did by taking this trip against apparently the advisement of the White House is that she really pushed it forward to the fore. And now we may have a new normal in which tensions between the U.S. and China, as well as China and Taiwan, of course, will be much, much higher than it has been in the past. It is unnecessary. We still have time to be able to find a way to resolve this issue. We've had a policy of ambiguity and one China policy for quite some time that has been working, probably should be staying put. The White House has said that it is still the policy, although Biden on a few occasions have made statements that seem to indicate the opposite. We cannot afford this trifecta of conflict. On the one hand with China, on the other hand, a drawn-out war in Ukraine that could escalate into a direct U.S.-Russia conflict. And then, of course, this third one, a crisis with Iran over the nuclear issue. The American people are tired. They're at odds with themselves. And the last thing they need is more foreign entanglements of this kind.
Dr. Parsi, in your article, you make the case that continuing to give aid to Ukraine is just prolonging the conflict without necessarily changing the outcomes or facilitating an end to the conflict. At the same time, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan put him in some political hot water with his detractors, despite being a popular policy among the people and something that Trump also promised to do. What do you recommend, or how do you see the Ukraine conflict ending when I'm sure the Biden administration has some political concerns about what it would look like to withdraw at this point after being so strident in its rhetorical support and financial support for Ukraine?
Well, I'm not arguing or advocating that there should be a withdrawal of that support necessarily. The argument is rather that if you're going to give this level of support, then it has to be coupled with a diplomatic strategy so that the military aid you're giving is creating a situation in which the Ukrainians will have a better position to be able to negotiate an end to this war. At the end of the day, this war will end with some form of negotiation. And any way you look at this, in fact, what the U.S. government itself is saying is that this is likely going to be a drawn-out war, should only increase our efforts to make sure that it doesn't. That means there cannot just be weapons being sent to Ukraine. There has to be much more of an effort to create a diplomatic, create the circumstances that allows diplomacy to start and to succeed. Now, Biden doesn't have a magical wand in which he can do this all by himself in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, the Russians have a veto on this as well. But we're not seeing the type of effort that is needed in order to create the atmosphere that is conducive to diplomacy, that is create the first steps that would actually bring about some form of a diplomatic process. And to just keep on pouring money into Ukraine and their military efforts without this is actually a disfavor to the Ukrainians themselves, in my view.
Well, to your point about whether or not there is a conducive atmosphere, politically, rhetorically, and in the media here at home. Here's an interesting story. CBS News has partially retracted a documentary in which it alleged shipments of U.S. weapons to Ukraine have gone missing. The official CBS Twitter account deleted a tweet which included a late April estimate that only 30% of aid was reaching the front lines in Ukraine. CBS has pledged to update the movie called Arming Ukraine with, quote, new information made available after filming. You know, many folks have seen this as, you know, part of the broader media's reluctance to report kind of truthfully on some of the kind of misconduct that's going on here in this area.
Indeed. And again, if you truly want to support the Ukrainians, this should be very worrisome if it turns out that only 30% of the military aid actually is going to the Ukrainian front lines. There should be investigations. There should be efforts to make sure that it's 100%, rather than taking down the story and pretending that it's not taking place. So again, if we truly want to make sure that the Ukrainians have a fighting chance so that their country is not invaded, they're not losing territory, we should be very concerned if it turns out that only 30% of the aid actually is going to Ukraine.
But it's not as if all, you know, weapons and all forms of aid get used up necessarily, right, in the war effort. How can we, you know, have any certainty that weapons currently being used by the side that we are supportive of, you know, well, one thing that could change. I mean, the dynamics of the political or diplomatic dynamics could change, or the weapons could eventually, you know, fall into the hands of people that are more hostile to us. How many times has that happened in the history of our funding of foreign wars? It's happened frequently, hasn't it?
Oh, all the time. I mean, in Syria, Al-Qaeda was using American weapons against the United States. Same thing was happening in Yemen, in which Al-Qaeda forces were using weapons that the United States had sold to the Saudis. How did those weapons end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda? In Libya, we poured tons of weapons. All of that ended up in the hands of various militias, which then ended up spreading mayhem and instability throughout all of North Africa. So we have clear examples of just pouring weapons into a war zone can significantly backfire on us, as well as further destabilize the region. So when we have some data that suggests that most of these weapons are actually not going to the Ukrainians, they're going elsewhere to oligarchs and other networks, then we should be, again, investigating it. And we should put a stop to those diversions, rather than shutting down the story and put on some sort of a media censorship. So this is extremely concerning. And again, if you truly want to support the Ukrainians, you should be very worried about this story rather than seeking to ignore it.
What are the ramifications of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus being so distracted, or being, you know, pulled in so many different directions? You count at least three major directions. Of course, there are, you know, other areas of concern, things we're looking at. And I get, you know, we have a very large federal government, too large for my taste, plenty of you know, bureaucrats to look at these things. But, you know, is our stockpile of resources, our own ability to defend the homeland or to be cognizant of threats, is it burdened by having to look on all of these places at once and try to manipulate events in our favor?
Well, it certainly is. I mean, we're having a military budget that just keeps on growing. In fact, last time Congress actually gave more money to the military budget than the president even asked for. What we're seeing with this is not just the militarization of our foreign policy, but also the militarization of our mindset, in which we increasingly think that every foreign policy issue has a military solution. When the only metric of our power is our military power, then we will end up becoming an empire, rather than doing what we should be doing right now, which is to show far greater restraint, invest far more in diplomacy, and recognize that some of the greatest existential threats that we as a country and life on this planet actually faces is not the threat of a nation state against another nation state, however problematic that yet may be. The greatest existential threats are pandemics and climate change, and shared threats that require a far greater degree of human collaboration that will not take place, simply cannot take place, if we're continuing to pursue a foreign policy based on the belief that we have to dominate in order to be safe.
And I saw someone making a point recently that on a very basic level, even outside of the kind of existential concerns that I think you very rightly raised, our ability to manufacture enough weapons to satisfy all of these, so-called needs is limited, and that there's only so much stuff coming out of these Lockheed Martin plants, et cetera, and that if we overinvest in sending weapons to Ukraine, that actually has a direct effect on our ability to defend ourselves and source materials to other parts of the world that are strategically necessary.
Yeah, whatever they're producing at Lockheed Martin and some of these other places, it's more than enough, I would say. We have military that is far larger than is needed in order to protect the United States. The belief that we have to intervene and dominate regions far away from us in order to keep ourselves safe is simply not true. It is proven false. It's actually made us less safe. We're not going to be more safe by having 750 bases around the world that actually drags us into military confrontations rather than the other way around. When you have that type of a network, when you have that type of a military construct, you're going to be tempted far too often to use the military precisely because you have it, even when it is not necessary. And this is a key reason as to why the United States has ended up in these endless wars that have impoverished the country at home, turned an entire generation of Americans against the belief that this is the way to keep us safe, but also making them realize that they're going to have a standard of living that is going to be lower than that of their parents to a very large extent because of our foreign adventures.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising after this.